Welcome to Reading the Room, a literary podcast featuring author interviews and discussions with bookish content creators. I am your host, Jalen, also known as The Bar in the Bookcase on YouTube. Today I am joined by Tom Crewe, author of the debut novel, The New Life, available today from Scribner in the US. The New Life is a novel that I saw on Twitter in its proof form floating around, and when I saw it, I was instantly compelled by it because at the time I was also finalizing my own podcast art with the black and yellow and gray aesthetic, and this book cover has a very similar look to it. And I looked into the book and I saw it was about queer longing, and I wanted it instantly for that reason. And since then, I read it, I loved it, and I'm so glad to have Tom Crewe be the first author on the podcast in 2023. During our discussion, I kind of just jumped right into unpacking the novel, and you'll want to do the same thing, but I wanted to give a quick synopsis of this book before getting into the interview. The novel is set in the summer of 1894, in which two men, John and Henry, begin writing a book in defense of homosexuality. Both men are married, and each marriage has its own forbidden love affair at its center. Shortly before the book is to be published, Oscar Wilde is arrested. John and Henry are faced with the difficult decision of proceeding with publication and risking imprisonment, or giving up the project for their own safety. The novel is really asking if there's ever a right time to attempt a new life, and the cost of moving forward or staying silent. This is a book that really begs to be discussed, and I'm very excited for this book to now be published to talk about it with more people. It's really morally compelling and lushly written, and I think you all will really enjoy it. And before we get into the interview, I wanted to give a quick plug for the Reading the Room Patreon. This is an independent podcast that I'm doing all on my own, and I have really lofty ambitions for Reading the Room into 2023 and beyond. And if you'd like to support that, there is a Patreon with two support tiers. One is $3, one is $5 if you'd like to donate. Now let's get into the discussion with Tom Crewe. Tom, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start with the title here of The New Life and thinking about a sort of core refrain in the novel of we must live in the future that we hope to make. And John and Henry thinking about what the potential their book has to change the law in the future for themselves and whether they're able to see that future in their lives. I wanted to ask you about how you landed on The New Life as a title and exploring this idea of the future versus the present for these characters.
Well, that's quite an interesting question because the title actually came quite late in the process. In fact, shortly before it was submitted to publishers. The original title was Inversion, inversion being the contemporary term for homosexuality. And inversion, in a way, was an organizing concept for the novel because the two couples have inverted circumstances. You know, there's a lesbian on one side, there's a gay man on the other. And then there's lots of little mirrorings through the novel that maybe readers will pick up on, or maybe they won't. So that was the original idea. And then at the last minute, my agent said, I don't really like this title. It seems a bit sci-fi or something. It gives the wrong idea. And he suggested The New Life, which is a phrase which recurs through the novel and actually captures much better the sense in the novel that people are reaching for something new and better, and I hope the novel generally, besides being about a set of specific people and specific concerns, is also about a much more universal reaching for a better way of living, a better way of understanding each other and the world. And that impulse, which I think we all recognize, the desire for something new and better, is there throughout the novel. And of course, as we all know, the grass isn't always greener, and therefore it comes with its own dangers and pitfalls and compromises, which helps create the drama of the book.
I wanted to ask you about the historical framework for this novel. And I know that you have a PhD in 19th century British history. The author's note after the novel, it says that John, he passed in, I believe, 1893, and this novel is then set in 1894. So you play with fiction and using the novel as the form to sort of explore these ideas. But I wanted to ask about how you approach writing about queer desire and sex from a historical perspective, and then also using these characters that were based in real life to explore these topics.
Oh, that's a big question. I came across the story. I was reading about Oscar Wilde just out of interest. My PhD, though it was about the late 19th century, it was about politics. It had nothing to do with any of this stuff. So I was reading about Oscar Wilde, and I came across the figure of John Addington Symonds, who was the basis for my John character. And I was just so struck by the discovery of this other late 19th century gay man who I didn't know, and I was someone who thought they knew quite a lot about this period. And he was new to me, and in fact, there was something so appealing about this man who had struggled with his sexuality all his life, had come to understand it, who had come to an intellectual understanding of it and had reconciled himself to his sexuality, and had not just done that, but had become a sort of gay rights activist in his own time. So that was very surprising to me, very interesting. There's something very appealing about that. So I started thinking, how do we write about gay life in Victorian Britain in a way that doesn't focus on Oscar Wilde, because Oscar Wilde is such a central, dominant figure. So that was my sort of way in. And then when I came across the fact that Symonds had written this book about homosexuality, with this man called Havelock Ellis, who was an equally interesting and unusual character, that's when I knew I could do something with that as a basis for a novel which explored the things I was beginning to be interested in. The second part of your question, the sex and queer desire, I don't know. I didn't think too much of it. People respond to it, and it's clearly a part of the book's appeal. And I hope it is a sexy book, because it should be, because otherwise I've failed in doing my job. I think it was important to write honestly and frankly about sex and sexual desire, because it is so much a part of what the book is exploring. I don't think we could understand John's journey to understanding his sexuality, embracing sexuality as an intellectual interest. If it had been purely treated as an intellectual interest, we would have lost the emotional dimension. It's a physical and exploration as much as an intellectual one, a physical awakening as much as an intellectual awakening. And so it was important to convey that to the readers. It's part of the emotional development of the book. And Henry's love and sex life is different, but equally it's fundamental to his sense of himself and his relationship with his world. So again, it's part of being honest about your characters and giving your characters their respect, I think.
The intro scene is one that will forever stay in my mind. It's so good, but it really plays into that as well. And I'll leave it to a surprise for readers, but it was a really strong opening, I must say. And then also, I wanted to ask about John and Henry's dynamic in this book in terms of the structure of the novel. So for a large part of it, they only discuss the book through letters to each other. And I wanted to ask you about how you chose to limit their communication to just letters for most of the book, and if that presented a challenge for you or not.
It's so hard to remember what you were thinking and feeling when you started a book. Now, coming up to 6 years ago, I think, and I'd never even tried to write a book before. I didn't know what I was doing. The whole thing is an intellectual journey and a very complicated challenge. So the thing I was thinking at the beginning was that in real life, these historical figures of Symonds and Ellis didn't meet at all. They never met. They managed to write this book together without ever meeting. So that was in my mind, and I was at that point, I think, more still working out the relationship between fact and fiction in my novel. And I think it struck me that actually it was quite a nice organizing principle at first, that these two men would arrive separately at their goal of writing a book about homosexuality, that they have separate reasons for being interested in the subject. And actually that can be dramatized better if they are kept separate in the reader's mind too, and you can see that they're coming from separate places with separate experiences. And of course it adds a frisson that they don't know why each other are interested. So it allows for for mismatched perceptions, mismatched ambitions and intentions, which means that when I bring them together later in the novel, the reader already understands that they're actually in quite different places, which allows the drama that follows from that to succeed, I hope.
Yeah, I definitely think it does. And I think one really interesting aspect of this novel that I found really clever and works really well is the idea of Henry being a bit of a mystery for the characters and for the reader, trying to understand what his ambitions are in the book. And it's a question that kind of becomes even more on the surface by the end of the novel. And it's still sort of left ambiguous as to Henry's intentions, which I think was really clever, as I mentioned. So in terms of Henry and Edith and Angelica and their sort of trio dynamic, I think it's really interesting and nuanced. So how did you craft that relationship dynamic?
Well, that was tricky, and it relates in a way to your previous question, because one thing about having these alternating narratives is that you can, especially when you're writing it, you can end up feeling like you understand one better than the other, or one is coming more easily, or one set of relationships, one storyline is going really well, and the other isn't. Is not. It's not going so well, and one of the problems I had is because John has a very strong storyline, very clear lines. It's very comprehensible. He's a gay man, married. He's struggling against his own time. But Henry is he's shy, he's quiet, he doesn't speak as much, which is always harder for a novelist to work with. And his set of relationships, his wife Edith and Edith's lover Angelica, is just a bit more complex and nuanced because it's not that what's at stake there is less transparent. So it was harder. It was harder to work through and understand. And I had to, after I'd finished my first draft, I spent the most time thinking about Henry's character, how I could bring him out, how he could be shy and quiet, yet still clear in the reader's mind. And most of all, what was going on with these two women, how to bring them to the forefront. What was their relationship all about? And most of all, for the novelist, what purpose is it serving in the novel? And one thing I eventually hit on was to think of them more as a trio rather than thinking of Henry over here and Edith and Angelica in a separate space. It was to try and conceptualize them as three people and see that there are different power dynamics within that trio and that they alternate over the course of the novel as events in the novel shift the balance between the partners. So that was a very helpful realization. I hope, as you say, that the relationship is a trio relationship and the reader's sympathies shift over the course of the novel as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it also, as you mentioned, it reflects also on John and Catherine's relationship and Frank, and their sort of trio in a different way. I think the way you use inversion, as you mentioned, is really interesting in this book to kind of think about these characters as sort of foils to each other in certain aspects. But I have to ask you about Catherine, who might be my favorite character in the novel, or certain scenes in here are so moving, and I think it raises a lot of questions about morality in terms of John's decision to embrace his sexuality, sort of in the face of Catherine and sort of saying, I need to do this for myself. And Catherine sort of left by the wayside in a certain sense. And the way that she sort of processes that information was really moving, particularly in my favorite scene in the book. I won't say what happens in this scene, but when Catherine and Henry meet, I love that section so much and what she says about the core themes in this book about the new life and about regret and thinking about what can actually be changed in one's life and how she sacrificed herself for her husband despite those trespasses against her. And so all of that to say, I wanted to ask you about Catherine and how you crafted those scenes.
Yes, it's nice to talk about Catherine. She's lots of people's favorite characters. I mean, the book is still a baby taking its first steps into the world, but already several people have said to me that she's their favorite character, which gives me a lot of pleasure, really, because one of the nice ironies in the book, or I hope it's one of the book's nice ironies, is that it would be so easy to sympathize so naturally with John as this closeted gay man living in the 1890s. But what I want readers to feel actually is all that the tension in him wanting to pursue his real and true new life and the damage he's doing to his long-suffering wife Catherine. So I always feel like I've done a good job when people take her side, because it means that people have been forced to go against what might be their natural sympathies. So yes, she's another figure who I kind of keep in the background at the beginning of the novel, because I think she gains in effect from being kept in the background, because we do sympathize with John. We initially enter John's story, and it's only later in the novel that we start to really feel and see the consequences for Catherine. So some of those big scenes, she has some big scenes towards the end, and they were some of the most fun to write, and some of the scenes that came most easily to me, I suppose, because I felt her indignation, I felt her distress and horror, and somehow her voice just came through very clearly in my mind. I could feel the things that she felt. And it's great to give her a voice. I mean, I think, again, this effect of keeping her in the background initially is that when she speaks, she really speaks. and she speaks very articulately about her position as a woman. And it means again that she also contrasts with some of the other women in the book. There are lots of women characters in the book who are very important, I think. And she stands for an older generation, a woman who didn't have some of these opportunities that came along later in the century about going to university, or having some form of work. She's a woman of an earlier period who has sort of subsumed herself in motherhood and matrimony. Again, I hope in those scenes we see that anger, that frustration. So she's a great character, and she hopefully, yes, complicates the whole thing, makes us see the costs of progress, that nothing is morally straightforward ever.
Absolutely, yeah. Because I found myself really surprised by, I guess, my shifting alliances, as you say, throughout the book, and what I thought the characters should do by the end of it. I mean, I wanted to ask you about the plot and using the trial as the sort of core plot driver in this book, and the idea of Oscar Wilde as well, and him being arrested, and I guess the question of the law and the trial and how that played for you in terms of driving home these sort of morally gray questions by the end.
Also, the book, in a way, as I said, was an experiment in trying to get rid of Oscar Wilde, try and push him out of center stage and see what's left behind, and see what the period looks like, if we change our perspective. But he always had to be there because his arrest and his trial was so fundamental in changing the public mood and throwing off course this more optimistic moment, of which John and Henry's book is a symptom. So he has to be there, and I think readers who know anything about the period will be waiting for something to happen, waiting because they might know he's coming. So yes, so the trial acts as a kind of spring for the plot in the second half of the book. The first half of the book is about the relationships, about the bringing together of the relationships. In a way, it's about showing that intimate, private world that we can easily forget it ever existed in late 19th century Britain. Gay people were able to have relationships. They did have relationships. Most of them avoided the law, never got into trouble. And it's important to me to show it wasn't all doom and gloom. It wasn't all tragedy, that people could explore, a range of possibilities, live a range of gay lives in the 19th century. But in a way, the Wilde trial flips the coin. And then we see actually there is always, nevertheless, this public dimension. And the public dimension intrudes in the most kind of visceral and dramatic way when this other gay man that they know nothing about, never meet, never see, he gets into trouble and it ruins their world, like a meteor coming out from outer space and blowing up their private world. So it's important for those terms. And then there are a series of consequences that spin out from that trial. And the rest of the novel is about these relationships in the kind of harsh glare of public scrutiny as the world forces its way back into their private, intimate space. And that's where the real drama of the second half of the book comes from.
And that contrast between those two things is so stark by the end of the novel, and how Henry in particular, I don't want to spoil anything, but there's this question about whether they should proceed with sort of being openly in favor of having this book published and being rigorous in their defense of the work as craft, and also this idea of free speech. And I'm a lawyer, and I was really drawn to the legal questions presented here in terms of the limits of the law and the limits of free speech, even despite, trying to advocate for what is right or what should be upheld legally, how that actually plays out in real life. Because there's this interesting question by the end of, even if the book is published, or even if homosexuality is not criminalized, there's still this sense of shame that the characters feel about being publicly themselves. And John is the sort of primary advocate for being himself, and he sort of has a spark near the end of the book to really just embrace it and kind of confess everything and just to be outwardly himself because he's been hidden for so long. But then the other characters are like, well, what are you actually sacrificing with that decision? And I loved those questions because it made me, during the first half when you're reading it, you're like, let's go, John, like let's do it. And you feel very strongly about it. But then when you see the real life consequences with the legal implications and trying to think like, well, is it better if they don't pursue this? Like, I don't know. I think you really do a great job with really adding a lot of nuance to that part of the plot. And I was really surprised by how conflicted, I felt, about a lot of what happens in the second half. I think it was really interesting to read. And I tend to ask on this podcast a lot of like purely craft questions, but I have to commend the plot in this book and just how fun and riveting it was to kind of see where you're going with it, particularly as it blended with real life as well. So
Oh, I'm very grateful you think so, and it's very nice to hear because I didn't really think of myself as writing a very plotty novel, and maybe it's the power of a trial or two trials to kind of focus events, create its own power and momentum. So that was maybe I was very lucky in my kind of structural tools. They helped me do that. I agree. I hope the book is interesting on those terms in terms of raising the question about, what's the best route to change? How, particularly in this period, how far could the legal change? Was the legal route the best? Or did they need to focus on the law, or we have versions of this change. Do gay people really what's the best thing for the gay movement to focus on? Gay marriage, or what, or should they have stayed committed to the more original ideas of breaking down the family and changing culture and gender roles? And so there are always senses of different routes and different possibilities. And I think there's a little moment in the book which is maybe relevant here, where John has a moment where he realizes that even if they changed the law, even if they succeeded in changing the law and gay people didn't have to go to prison for being gay, it would still be terrible. He sort of has a little insight and he suddenly thinks, well, they would still be embarrassed around me. People still wouldn't want to know me. They wouldn't want to associate with these kinds of people, which of course was the case, in Britain. Homosexuality was legalized in 1967, but it's only in the last 10, 15 years where feels like there's been mainstream mass cultural acceptance, and it's no longer an issue. Those things are always, if not in tension, in dialogue with one another. The legal structural changes and the societal cultural ones. So yes, I'm glad that those questions are at the forefront at the end of the book.
I think one thing too that I picked up on while reading this that I think is really interesting just from like a novelist's perspective is how like lush and descriptive this book is too. It was just a joy to see how you set up the scenes and how the setting and the atmosphere of what's going on around these characters really plays into how that reads on the page. It just feels very descriptive and evocative. And I just wanted to ask you about, do you have like any influences on your work on that front, or how did you kind of come to the description and scene setting?
Well, I mean, I'm sure lots of writers don't like to be to claim too many influences. I don't feel as though I've been influenced so much as I feel like I'm inspired all the time by what I'm reading. I really like, there's a Saul Bellow quote where he says, a writer is a reader who's moved to imitation. And I like that idea. I like the sense that I'm always reading and always being provoked and inspired by what I'm reading to try something new. And what if I did something a bit like that, or more often, what if I tried to make the reader feel the way this book has made me feel? What if it's so in that sense it's often intangible. It's a how do I create a sort of feeling? Near the book's opening, there's a chapter set by the Serpentine, a river in Hyde Park in London, and John is watching the men swimming in the river as they still do today, and though with swimming trunks these days rather than in the nude. And I was writing that scene, and I had in my head the opening of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James, and I've never reread. I read more than 10 years ago, but I wanted to capture something of a kind of sunny greenness, a kind of open freshness, which the James novel begins with people having tea, I think, outside in the garden. And his scene and my scene are completely different, but I wanted to create a similar effect somehow. Whether I do or I don't know. But that's in a way how I work. And I suppose if I did see myself as writing in any sort of tradition, I probably see myself as in a line that descends from Henry James through um, people like Elizabeth Bowen and Sybil Bedford, maybe someone like Henry Green, these kind of writers who have a very ornate descriptive prose, but one that is maybe odd, slightly unusual. I think I go for slightly unusual images, or I'm quite interested in the shape and rhythm of sentences, and I hope that sometimes they are surprising or they work in curious ways. I certainly look at the sentence as an opportunity to do something interesting. So I wasn't too self-conscious about it, but I think that's probably where I am if I think about forebears in English prose. But
Tied to that, I mean, this is your debut novel, and so I wanted to ask you about sort of your path to writing this book and being an editor for the London Review of Books, how that informed, now writing in a fictional territory. How did that look for you?
well, I always wanted to write a novel my whole life. So I think when I was about 6 years old, I said when I wanted to grow up, uh, I wanted to be an author. So I was writing stories when I was about 5, 6, 7. Little, I used to call them books, and it's just something I've always wanted to do. Always, 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 and so it was always something that was just in the distance. But I did go through academia first, and I did a PhD. And at one point, I thought, I still want to be a writer, but maybe I want to be a writer of history books. Maybe that's a marrying of my interests in writing and in history. But about halfway through my PhD, I realized that actually that's not what I wanted to do. I didn't want to be an academic historian. So then I went back to writing fiction and thinking of that's what I wanted to get into somehow. But of course, it feels like a very far off possibility, dream, and one has to live in the meantime. So I finished my PhD, and I got an internship at the London Review of Books, and where I still work as an editor. It'll be 8 years next year. And at that point, I started writing a lot for the LRB. So I've written, nearly 40 essays for the LRB on lots of subjects, and that gave me a great training in writing for a different kind of audience, a public audience, and writing on a different subjects and being bolder, thinking of myself as a kind of creative writer rather than an academic one. And all the while, I was writing short stories. I'd had the idea for this novel while I was still doing my PhD, so I had the idea more than a decade ago. So I knew the novel I wanted to write. I just needed to get the time to start, which I eventually did. I eventually thought, well, I'm never gonna write this novel if I don't bloody get myself going with it. So I did. So I started, and then I wrote it in my spare time. I did an hour before breakfast every day, and worked at the weekends, and it slowly came together. But I think my work at the LRB, both my writing, which made me a better writer, a sharper writer, taught me different things. That was very helpful, but also my work as an editor, I think helped me get the text into shape. I think it made me pay closer attention to my sentences. I think it made me more critical, more self-critical, more sort of less sentimental about my own work, more prepared to cut, more prepared to see where I was going wrong, what wasn't working, made me more brutal, I think. And certainly in the later stages when you really are editing your own work, I definitely felt that I was fast and efficient because that's what I do for my day job. So in all those ways, all these slightly random strands in my life with writing a through line all came together in a helpful way.
I don't want to ask like the annoying question of what your next book is going to be, but do you think like your future novels would still be from a historical perspective or write something in the present? What does that look like for you?
I feel a bit conflicted about it because I really hate the term historical fiction. I really dislike it. Though I know lots of people use it, and people will use it talking about my book. But I find it very narrowing because I don't see myself as writing something called historical fiction. I see myself as writing fiction. I don't think I'm writing a historical novel. I'm writing a novel. I just don't. I'm just interested in the things I'm interested in, and I find it bizarre that there's something called literary fiction and something called historical fiction. You either write a good book or you don't. So I find that very frustrating because there is still, I think, a kind of people look down on what they think of as historical fiction. People say, oh, I don't read that, or I don't like that. That's not something I'm interested in. So people can be quite snooty. There's a certain trashiness, I think, that's still associated with the category of historical fiction, and I don't believe in that category. So I'm not being critical of anyone who writes books set in the past. I think that's fine. So questions like yours, I always feel like some part of me says, oh, I need to write a book set in the present to be taken seriously, or people will think, oh, why does he never do that? He can't be a very brave or interesting writer. So those are my impulses. That's the drama that's going on in my head when I hear something like that. Sort of feel an impulse to say, absolutely, I will write something in the present, take me seriously. But the fact is that I don't. At the moment, the things I know I want to write, I have about 3 ideas for novels in the future beyond the one I'm writing now, and most of them are set some significant time in the past, pre-20th century, and then there maybe one would be in the 20th century, but still, maybe 40 years ago. So what that says about me, I don't know. I'm just interested in the things I'm interested in. That's the way my imagination works.
I'm very curious about what you're reading. I always close the podcast with some book recommendations, just ask about what you're interested in. And so, do you have any books that you're reading right now that you're really enjoying or not?
Oh, yes. Well, this is one of my favorite questions, and it's a pleasure to be able to talk about her. At the moment, I am on a run of reading the 19th century Scottish novelist Margaret Oliphant, who wrote as Mrs. Oliphant, and she wrote her first novel in around 1850, and she wrote her last novel in around 1896. So she had this kind of enormous, nearly 50-year long career. And she wrote 98 novels, unbelievably, and about 25 works of nonfiction. So she was enormously prolific, and she did this all while she was a widow, and she was doing all this in order to fund herself and her family. She had 3 children. She also ended up taking in nieces and nephews. She had alcoholic brothers she helped pay for. So she was this incredibly industrious and prolific woman who endured a lot of hardship in her life, and all of her children ended up dying, and her nephew died, and she'd worked so hard to keep this enterprise going, whilst also having a nice time, wearing nice clothes, drinking champagne. She was an amazing woman, and is hardly in print at all now, which is very tragic to me. She's a very, very interesting Victorian novelist who's not like a lot of other Victorian novelists. She's very interested in women, in gender, in thinking about how gender plays out in the way in which ideas about gender shape how men treat women and how women treat men. She's very interested in marriage, very good about writing about marriage, mostly unhappy marriages. So she's very unsentimental, whereas lots of even the very greatest Victorian novelists are very sentimental. She's unsentimental, she's dry, she's witty. She can write very well, very fluently and dramatically, though her prose can be a bit scrappy because she was writing so much so quickly. She's funny. I've read a few of her novels before, and I've now read 4 in a row, and it's become a pet project of mine. So I recommend, if any publishers are listening out there, please get in touch with me, and let's get her back into print.
So, do you have, I guess, one of her books you'd recommend to start with?
Yes. Well, there's a book which is actually probably the most easy to get hold of, which I actually wrote about for the London Review of Books once, called Miss Marchbanks, which is confusingly spelt Marjorie Banks, Marjori Banks, which is a very funny and delightful novel about a young woman who sort of decides to take possession of her town. She thinks her town is very boring and stayed, and she shakes it up in various ways by holding parties and bullying the men, and it's just a very funny, witty novel, and again very interesting about men. It's a female novelist writing very sharply and critically about men in the 1860s, which feels very, very fresh. And there are some wonderful characters, and I defy anyone not to enjoy that novel.
And that's really fun finding, I guess, a more niche author recommended on the pod. So thank you. And also, congratulations on this. I know we're recording this like a month out for publication, but I'm very excited for this to be out in the world because I finished this and I was like dying to talk about it with someone. So I'm excited to have more people to read it and to unpack what's going on in this book. I think it's really interesting and rigorous and just a really unputdownable read. So congratulations. And I can't wait to read your future work as well.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk about it.